Go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so the kind of looking at the legislative update, which that won't take very long. Looking at, although I have the audit, I didn't get it. I haven't even had it 24 hours. So we are looking at it and trying to review it, and we'll share what it preliminarily looks, but hopefully we can make some changes to it. And then a little bit of the financial summary that is the impacts related to that audit, and then a couple of items for 21-22, and then circling around in preparation for our next meeting. So right now we have on the calendar today's meeting, and then the 19th, and then June 2nd are kind of the next three that we have, and hopefully at that point we'll have the final information needed for the board update and assumptions that'll go into the next year's budget plan. This is kind of a timeline of our meetings, but then also the board meeting. And the reason this is important is there is a statutory date in which we have to navigate towards. So we have our meeting here on the 10th, and more than likely it'll be the June 14th meeting that will be sort of that assumptions, but we have as late as the 28th. So in these next three meetings will be those final kind of board decisions for 21-22. Our year end is June 30. We do have some trailing transactions in July that are June activity. We have our last of our bills, and then we also have a final payroll. Typically, this is the July 12th is the board meeting that we would normally have an organizational meeting, for example. And then we have this very short window of time that we close everything out and prepare our state forms. The board will approve it for publication. We publish it, we have a hearing, it's approved, and it's certified August 25th. So that's kind of where our timeline is. The interesting thing is that we have no legislative action at this point. So technically, we don't have any funding for next year. We are working under the assumption that what was in the governor's budget, which is in compliance with Gannon and our financial lawsuit on equitable and adequate funding for K-12 education, is what that will look like for next year. There's a lot of conversations, things have been approved, things have been vetoed, but ultimately, including the 20 mils on our general fund that should be extended for the next 2 years, that's in part of this legislation that's not been approved. So again, technically, we don't really have funding for 21-22. So hopefully in the next couple of weeks, the legislature will finalize what that looks like so that we can navigate it if it actually is going to have some impacts we don't know about on our budget for next year. So that's always fun. Looking preliminarily at 2021, our audit results, and the reason this is important is twofold. It will give us a baseline of what our weightings are and how to navigate that going forward for next year, and let us know what that enrollment is if we don't end up using it for next year, which we've talked about earlier, using a look back to a little bit of a higher number. That's an option to us so we don't lose as much enrollment. But then that number that we do end up with will be part of the averaging when we look at 22-23. So it works through our long range planning. So we're looking at our audit exceptions and we're reviewing those to see if we agree with the auditor or if we have follow-up, other things that we can navigate to make a change to those numbers. The weightings are the big piece because they impact the current year, which means before year end, we have to figure out how to navigate any of those shortfalls or deficits that were unplanned, which we already knew we anticipated when we had our superintendent's report that we would have some of those to navigate. So if you remember the 647 FTE of our core enrollment, that's for future planning, but the weightings tied to that decline in these areas of transportation at risk, K-12 at risk, CTE, and bilingual impact us currently. And we've talked through these at several other meetings, so hopefully this will continue to make sense. So I've updated the charts that we talked about earlier, in which we talked about our weightings and what we estimated them to be and what the unaudited number would be. And then we have our preliminary audit information. So when we talked about this from our SO66, we were down this 307.4 FTE in weightings, and the majority of that was in at risk, and you can see kind of where they are. The gray bar now is the additional decrease found during our preliminary audit or our audit. So adding to the 307 would now indicate for the current year it's 360 point FTE, 360.5 FTE that we would have to realize as a decrease in our funding in the current budget year. So we were looking originally at 1.4, that 53 equates to 242. So that would make, unless we can reverse any of her exceptions, a decrease in our funding of $1.6 million related to these weightings. And this just is a chart of the revenues that tie to that. Some of our decreases in our CTE minutes, so we're evaluating that. Again, the at-risk was minimal. Most of the others were minimal. So that's challenging to us. But on top of that, then our LOB gets impacted because those weightings decrease our budget, therefore our LOB. And so instead of 465 as a decrease, it's 82,000. So this 548,190 becomes the new total. So when we look at that, we have what we submitted or what we thought we were at that $1.8 million that we've been talking about to date. Now it looks like it's about $2.1 million. So an additional 325,000 related to just the weightings in which there is a deficit that we need to sort out. This whole meeting is going to be full of such good news. So I'm going to navigate forward. Virtual is also decreasing on us. And this we're still sorting out because part of the exceptions, there's duplicates, kids, and another school district claims a kid and we claim a kid. And so now we have to hash out which district actually gets the kid. So there's a number of those on the list. And so we have to navigate through those. There's a number of them that are prorated between our own buildings. Some, they spend time in brick and mortar and they spend time in virtual. So we have to make sure that we agree with what those schedules look like and the change to our funding if we can make sure we agree with what she has come up with and make sure then she's captured everything. But if you remember from earlier, we published very high because we anticipated there would be a large growth in our virtual school. Our unaudited showed this 1,264 full-time, part-time at 38.8, and then the credits, which we won't audit out until actually next year. Preliminarily, we're at 1,101 full-time, 109.5 part-time, and then the credits, like I said, are actually something they'll audit out a year from now. If you remember, our funding on full-time is 5,000. Our funding on part-time is on 1,700. So that does impact planned dollars that we might have there. And so unaudited, we were looking at this 6.5 number. This will reduce it to 5.8. And so when we were looking at what we anticipated the increased resources would be and what we thought the growth in expenditures would be. At the time of the unaudited information, we were looking at possibly having this $870,000 to help support our general fund. That decreases, but their expenditures have decreased below what we anticipated their growth need would be. But we're not going to realize the full additional revenues, and so that number is this 544,294 that it appears to be. Again, this is completely still pending us kind of back and forth with audit to make sure that we've captured everybody the way they should be captured and that nobody's missing. So we're at that stage of the audit. So it's still preliminary, but this is what it looks like if it was to go through as she presented it. So although I don't anticipate a lot of changes, I do anticipate a few. I can't predict what that would look like though. But that does change our big number at the top from the 1,000,008 to this 2,195,318. So when we shared with the board last meeting some of the ways we were navigating the 1,000,008, we had looked at some of these expenditures that we are seeing in the current year as underspent due to us being remote most of the year and then hybrid, a good part of the year. There were a lot of expenditures that just didn't occur as a result of us being in those modes of instruction instead of being on site 100%. It did not cover all of the 1,000,008, and we were anticipating some of those dollars from the virtual state aid to help us. With this larger number, it changes our shortfall, whereas we were basically break even at the board meeting presentation. We are now short $633,000 as a result of the virtual monies not being as high to help offset, and this number up here being higher as well. So if there is good news, on top of that, we were talking about this $498,000 utility bill that was for our Arctic blast. And if we had to put that in here, we would be closer to a million plus. We are looking at paying only last month's amount and joining the KASB Coalition for Legal Arbitration on that bill. So at this point, once it's in dispute, we believe we won't have to necessarily pay it currently, but it'll be on hold to be paid. So it'll be a contingency. It'll be under dispute. Therefore, it won't be something that we're paying, but it will be a legal note as disputed liability on our audited financial statements. And it delays us capturing or having to pay for the cost currently. If we end up having to pay it, are going to be looking at loans or something like that, or we would have to make the cuts in order to pay it. I heard you try to ask a question. Yes.
Yeah. So that means it will not be encumbered this year currently, or will it have to come out of this year's budget eventually? You have to pay it.
Those are still things I have to work out through legal. I'm assuming at this point it does not. If it does, that 633 becomes a million something. So I'm hoping that we've just traded our decrease in weightings for the fact that we have a utility bill that is being put on hold for us. But according to what I've gotten so far out of KASB, the dispute would put it on hold. And then it would not be something that we would pay or incorporate in this budget, but that does not mean that it won't come back to haunt us. It doesn't mean it goes away forever, but it gets put aside. So if I had to encumber it, that 633 would be 633 plus 498 as a deficit. 498. If I don't have to encumber it, I'm still dealing with the deficit of 633 due to the additional weighting decreases and the virtual state aid not being as high as it looked like it could be at the time of our SO 66. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. I guess worst case scenario, although definitely not possible, we would probably have to go into deficit if we needed to pay that.
So we would probably apply for no fund warrants, potentially, which would be a loan of some kind that we can do by statute. There is also the new Senate bill that allows for some loan capacity that was approved at the state that districts might be able to piggyback on if we can't pay it all in a single amount. So we would have to potentially look at one of those avenues if the dispute was you still owe it, if it came as a result of the dispute. So this just puts it on hold. It does not necessarily say that we're done with it. We are paying the 54 initially to avoid any penalties and interest and giving us time to, because they would have started charging interest on that amount due if we'd not done at least that much. Once it's filed as disputed, then even if we get past the date in which they extended the time frame, they shouldn't be charging us penalties and interest. The one thing we still don't know, and we won't know till May or early June, is what the state will do with our special education categorical aid, if that will be the same as what they provided us as a number to work with for budget, or if it will be something less. And so once we know that, we'll bring that into the mix. So right now, we are looking at, and we'll have to talk about further, but we are looking at what will have to not happen between now and June 30, limiting purchasing as much as possible to minimize anything between now and June 30. And shifting it as a July 1, and that would be district-wide. So we'll be looking at that. We do have some expenditures that we pay the last week of June in order to make sure they're effective and active on July 1. It's possible on some of them to pay it instead on July 1, effective July 1, but once we make that shift forever and forward, it will always be that way, because you can't double up then in the next year. If you had enough money to do that, you would keep it in the sequence that it exists today. So it's a one-time fix, but it doesn't help us. It sort of goes back to those were non-recommended things, and our reserves and things over the years have taken their hits as a result of different decisions, and there's very few things left to us to navigate the kind of deficit that's been put upon us due to the enrollment declines and the waiting declines that we've seen as a result of COVID. So that's my bad news for the current year. Any further questions related to that? Something I didn't share that you want to know more about, or thoughts? We'll bring back some of those things that we've come up with to help address this probably at the next meeting, but just not wanting to keep putting off meeting. I needed to share where we were sitting, and the audit's not final, so this is not a final number yet. We should have that for sure by the next meeting. Any thoughts or questions? I need balloons or something to cheer me up here. Okay, we're going to move on. 21-22, where are we? So last time we shared a little bit about just the ESL and that those projections for what ESL staffing, we've looked at thresholds, we've looked at different things in other areas, but this is an area we didn't know what the estimated need was for ESL next year. And so last time I had shared what the current year looked like. So I received this information back. I'm going to start with the chart over here on the right. So in their planning, these are the buildings that we provide ESL support staff to, and these are layered on top of. These are extra supports based on students that are eligible to receive services under the state and federal guidelines. So projections of students by site and doing their best to project what kindergartners would look like. The current ratio is based on this 30-to-1. So if you calculate that out, this is what projected would be the FTE that they would anticipate needing. And then we have 3 FTE that are kind of outside the buildings for this total down here. So this was the 2021 allocation, but they didn't use all of that. They only used this amount here. And so instead of using the proposed of the 25.5 on the calculation, they're looking to use what last year's allocation was, because they really weren't quite staffed to the full. So looking at 24.5. So in the buildings, we've been budgeting 24.75. You can see that down here at the bottom of my chart on the left. And they're looking at 24.5. So the reduction that we could actually realize going into next year, and we need all the savings we can get. So that's what that limit is going to be, another 16,000 as a result of that 0.25 FTE. But that is a little bit of a savings. So this is kind of what they look to be staffing those ESL supports for next year based on buildings. And if a building chooses to do 2 pairs instead of 1 FTE, they could get 2 bodies for 1. That is an option that ESL uses on occasion. So for example, if I have 2 FTE here, I could do 1 certified position and I could do 2 classified positions. The 2 classified equal the other FTE. Does that make sense? So anyway, we have a 0.25 that we can realize in this particular arena, and that'll go on the list. The other thing I wanted to update you on that is where we are with thresholds and staffing. So in visiting with Samry yesterday, this was just kind of where we were in planning. And the sections or the FTE that's been assigned to the buildings to date. This is using the projections that we have, but they're also navigating it by looking at all of our kindergarten roundup numbers, and then any trends or things that the principals might know in their building, and the building principals are working with HR to say, you know, this is what I need next year, this is maybe not what I need, and those kinds of things. So right now they are at this 207 based on, you can see sections for kindergarten first by building. This is with the transition of Kennedy occurring and the new planned kind of expected information at Prairie Park, New York, and Portland. So you can see that the 3rd grade actually jumped and they've got the sections there. There is a question that this 4 sections may not need to happen at Prairie Park. So that it's still showing, but it may go away. But the good thing is we're staying within our 213 that was our target, actually giving them still 3 to work with as we continue to navigate through the rest of this year and into next year with projections changing, families making their decisions on what they are or aren't going to do for school next year. And so we're on target. We're not having to come up with something different at this stage. And then we also have additionally and are working to continue to write into the Title IIA needs assessment for next year's federal monies that we would maintain these 3 FTE for contingency as well. So far that all looks like it's playing out in the way we had hoped and planned. Any thoughts or questions on that? So that's good news. So where we are then is, this is our summary for 21-22. Not a lot has changed. That's kind of But we are close to that break-even point, and this is what we had shared with the board. This deficit up here that we're looking at, I have not changed. I'm waiting to see for sure what is going to come out of the audit so it doesn't continue to just be this changing number. Even anticipating with the audit decrease, if we consider 50% of our enrollment coming back, I have a typo up there, I apologize. Up to this point, we have not planned on any of the weightings coming back. But if 25% say of the weightings come back as a result of the increase in enrollment we do get, we'll probably be able to continue to say this is the deficit. If I have to incorporate those weightings and plan that none of them come back, that number would be bigger. But it's not realistic to think we won't get some of those FTEs back. There is one component of all of this in the weightings that is quite the discussion right now, because food services, USDA is going to continue with a free lunch program for all students going into next school year through the end of the year. They are talking about families not needing to submit free and reduced lunch applications. Because there's no need to as it relates to lunch. The dilemma on the KSDE side is all of those applications and information from those applications ties to how we get our Title I funding, ties to how we get our at-risk funding, ties to how and who we waive fees to. It helps us when we look at scholarships for students. So there's a number of things, those data, all the data that we pull in our kids system, and when we look at our socioeconomic status of kids and at-risk factors, all of that comes from those free and reduced lunch applications. And if USDA says, nope, you're not going to do those next year because they're instead of saying you can still do it, they're kind of saying at this point, no, you're not allowed to do it kind of thing. The reality is there's so many other things that are based on that. So I'm not real comfortable with how we're going to determine some of those funding factors until they sort that out. If we don't have families fill out those applications to determine free meal status, our at-risk funding will go way, way down. And we saw that in the weightings this year with the enrollment drop. Because lunch was free, there was no reason for families to turn in those applications, even though the fee waiver was tied to it. The applications submitted this year have been less than expected. Even with the enrollment drop, the numbers should be a little bit higher. And in some of the buildings, it impacts a little bit of the ranking even on title, because the percentage is different than it would be in a normal year when we've had school in session and lunch has been served as normal. So that's a variable that we don't know enough about yet, nor how it will impact us next year, but it does have implications of how funding could be calculated going forward. It also impacts the ESSER money. And our ESSER money is based on those Title I information. And so ESSER 3 and how it's divvied out to districts could be impacted by those numbers that get turned in as we go forward, depending upon what moment in time they use that number. So that's just a pickle we don't know about yet, but it is another variable in the just very complicated mix of things that we have to think about going forward. So right now, I'm keeping that the same. This is the section that's still pending items. You can see the reference point over here, but we do know that health and insurance is after the bids is a no cost for 21-22. So we can answer that question. This still looks to be accurate based on what we know. This property insurance is still pending for the current year. With a potential of a 10% in the current year increase, let alone what it will happen then in 21-22. So this is still pending until we have that final. And this is turning out to be a higher number than we anticipated based on the known liability on May 4th, both for reasons of the insurance and the 7 years that retirees get that the district pays for as part of that early retirement. And although there was, people that drop off and people that come on, the dollars tied to the people that are being paid out for 21-22, it is a higher number. It did increase by almost 10 FTE overall in the early retirement pool of staffing. We do know that 3 FTE is a decrease for those buildings that were not part of Kennedy using our current thresholds. These numbers are similar to what you've seen. The 7.23 for middle school, high school is flat. Whoops. We have the Kennedy built in. We have the ESL built in. We have some of these things that we've had on the list for a while now. And we're almost at that break even at this stage. The $3,900 or $895 is basically the tipping difference. There are 2 big areas that will are things that we need to kind of keep watching and talk about, and really are on the list for next time. There's a lot of restructuring going on. There's a lot of, people leaving, people reevaluating what that looks like, shifting of people. So, and then reevaluating what those vacancies are and what does or doesn't need to be filled for next year. I'm hoping I have a better field to be able to share what that looks like and what savings we can actually put forth as it ties to that. And then the ongoing, just some other areas to bring forward. So at this stage, that's where we're at, and we're pretty much break even at this point. But there is those pending items that I still don't have any information about or know what that looks like. So we're still working through these 2 open slots on the chart, and hopefully then in the next couple of meetings we can come up with what this would look like to share with the board for those assumptions going into 21-22. So for the next meeting, which is the 19th of May, I hope to have a final audit in which I can share anything that we've talked about, kind of what that pans out to be both for the current year and next year. Giving you a status update on what things have been put into place to make sure that we can close the year not in a deficit, because by law we can't be. So we have to come to zero for whatever it takes. So that's not an option. Since we're in a balanced budget state, we have to have that be balanced. If there's any legislative decisions that finally come to fruition and they have impacts on what we're thinking about, then we'll bring that in. And then try to review those vacancies in departments and programs throughout the district, plans for filling and or restructures that are happening in order to add to the list any potential savings we can generate from that, and then anything else that we can bring forward for discussion. I think there's we'll need to revisit virtual education and what that looks like could be for next year, and get a feel for if there's going to be growth, they're going to be decrease, how that's going to impact us, as well as just other programs such as special education. Does ESSER grants have anything that's going to impact us? Things like that. So that's where we stand. I wish I had a little bit more information. I don't like the fact that our audit is still outstanding. There's just still quite a few balls to drop, that nothing is final. We're still working in a very fluid environment, which is not the best way to run a railroad, nor does it help for sleep, but it is what it is. So those are what I had to share with you. What questions, thoughts, things do we want to navigate? Otherwise, we'll circle back around next time and see where to go.
Hey, Kathy, this is Marcia Bergens. I have a question just based on past precedent with, and I was the 1 year hire, pink slip, rehire kind of situation. When we don't know, especially with virtual ed, because as we go through part of our process right now is asking families, what are your plans for next year? And with a caseload of 32 right now, I have half of mine who are returning either to their Lawrence brick and mortar or to their traditional district brick and mortar. So, but we're keeping all of, not just the USD 497 staff that moved in to help with the increase, but the new hires. And we're also posting. Is there, I mean, I'm not advocating for the pink slip and then rehire. And I'm just kind of curious because we didn't see the virtual staffing on that piece of it. Like, how is that determined when we know?
At the academic.
Does that?
Marcia, does make sense. Sammy and I have been working with Monty and Candy. And so what we, as students are planning to leave, we also see the students who are enrolling. And so based off those projections, that's where the staffing is coming from. We have some positions posted just based off of the projections, similar to what we have in the brick and mortar. The reason we don't do the 1 year thing anymore at the virtual is because what would happen is we would have to implement our rifting across the district, because the virtual staff is a part of the district, so the master agreement applies to them. So in some cases, if somebody is not local and they will be the natural, that we would have to non-renew, we would not renew them, and or if we have to move staff around to brick and mortar openings. 1 year it did come to that, and if it's people who are not local, that's when they have to make different decisions. But we used to do the virtual completely separately, but because remember K-12 teachers, I don't know if you were there when K-12 teachers were virtual, they weren't our employees, so we navigated it differently then. So it was a little different then, but then when we took it all on, we had to follow the same procedures that we follow for all of our staff. Does that make sense?
It does. So we're projecting that we'll be at that same, hopefully those same numbers, and not just where we pandemic. Perfect.
Yeah, the same numbers, maybe a little higher, because a few districts like Blue Valley originally said that they were going to offer a virtual option. Now they're not at any level because their numbers weren't high enough, and so financially they couldn't take it on. So there are other districts who originally thought that they were going to be able to offer a virtual option, and they're now letting their families know and sharing virtual options with their families. So it may increase, because I know that information just went out to a couple of districts last week.
Thank you. That makes sense. Thank you.
Any other questions at this time? No? Okay.
I don't have a question, Kathy, more of a comment and ask, I guess, is, I know we do a lot with budget, but one of the other things that this committee is charged with doing is program evaluation as well. So whether that's internal programs or prospective programs, as we think about, our budget story over the past couple of years, not the most exciting and riveting story, but it feels like we've been on the defense a lot. So the more that we can be on the offense, in terms of what do we do to attract families, because we know enrollment drives this budget. And so I'm looking at Myron, thinking about the redesign presentation that he just presented. Is that something that, I know we'll advertise that, but things like that, what programs that are not currently happening in our schools that would be potential drivers of students and families to the district? We're not seeing a decline as in our enrollment in high schools as we are in elementary. So again, looking at the elementary program and seeing programming and seeing what are some things that can attract families to Lawrence, but at the same time, not doing it just for the purpose of attracting families, but also doing it to meet the needs of the existing students that are there as well. And so I think with the redesign process that helps. But I think we're also at a pivotal point coming on the back end of this pandemic where we've done some things differently, and can be really creative in terms of programming. So really being strategic with the budget and our program offerings.
Dr. Lewis, a few years ago, the district made a determination, and Kathy, maybe you can speak to this, around transfers that we wouldn't take any longer. It's probably not a large number of students, but building on what Dr. Lewis has said, can you talk a little bit about that and whether that's something we could open up? The state was impacted in particular.
Yeah, so we have taken some out of district transfers. It's dependent on the space. So when we get them, if let's say they're asking for Free State and they're full, and if there's space at Lawrence High, we can say, if you want to come, you can go to Lawrence High. Or if they ask, can they go to Langston, we'll say we have space in these schools. So the Samory's team, and Samory can jump in, they evaluate them and make a determination based off space and that kind of thing. But in some of our buildings that they want to go to, there's no space.
Okay, so so what I was told was that we don't take them any longer, and it sounds like that's not the case.
We've taken
We
some
would
this
take
year.
them if we have an opening, and we offer them an opening in another building if we have one.
Yeah, when
Thank you.
the last information that probably was updated was when there, and Kathy can talk about when the finance was not dependent on a number, like it was just frozen. So it hurt us to take students because we weren't getting any funding for them.
Yeah, it would have been during the block grant period in which funding was flat.
And Kelly, in the past few years, we've had to close certain elementary schools to transfers and to like West and Southwest, and Brad knows this too. But we are not advertising those as being closed right now. We have had to turn some internal transfers away due to space and classrooms and such, but we have accepted out of district transfers this year. Sometimes we do wait a little bit for kindergartners, out of district transfers for kindergartens, just to let that settle a little bit before we take kindergarten families. So.
Dr. Lewis, you asked what programming changes have been made. I can only speak for the virtual part of it, but the programming at the elementary part of virtual, Candy has the introduction of regular expectation of teaching classes, especially at the time in which we got kids from brick and mortar schools, was huge because that's what those kids were used to and that's what they were expecting. And the fact that that was now an expectation and now a different piece of our program, I think we are holding on to some kids who originally were going to be just a 1 year, get me through the pandemic piece. But now that they see that they can have regular teacher instruction in addition to being home, I think that piece has played into keeping some kids who were not going to be other than just that 1 year pandemic sit or seat. And then the other piece, I have a question. Is there any way that we can offer at the virtual programming the ESL service, or does that have to be in person? Because we do have some of those that I don't know if we would get, I would assume we would get the funding if they are eligible and we provide, because we do have teachers who are certified.
So
Yeah,
Marcia, we probably can talk offline, but ESL students can definitely attend virtual school, and just like special ed students or whatever services they qualify for, they should still be receiving those.
Yeah, we should be providing them services, and if it's as Dr. Stubblefield for that, we definitely need to have a conversation if they're not being provided services or not identified. I'm not sure. So yeah, we definitely want to have a conversation to make sure we are providing those services.
Well, I think the services might be getting there. It's just, are we getting the funding too? Because I'm looking at the dollars.
Okay.
Yeah, it would be services with an ESL endorsed teacher and then tracking that time. And they do have to fit within those guidelines. So it really would be a further discussion and involve Leah. And I don't see them on the list ever. So I can't address that, but it makes sense to maybe have a follow-up conversation to see why maybe. one thing about the ESL and even CTE is the weighting that we get does not cover what we're currently expending in those areas. It's just some additional dollars, but it does not fully cover those program costs. We do have to absorb the difference in our general fund. Okay, anything else then? I will let you go. And if you think of something, please email and we'll meet the next time on May 19th. Hopefully with some additional news on our audit, which will help us going forward. So. Okay, well, you guys all have a wonderful evening. Hopefully it's outside.
Thank you, Kathy, and happy Teacher Appreciation Week to our teachers.
Thanks.